Technical difficulties. So we are back on. Let me just kind of restart and reset to where we were. So what I was talking about previously was the 10 commandments of EQing and how that can really help your music, because you need to have the fundamentals down. And if you don't have the fundamentals down, then that's how you have problems with an amateur sounding mix. That is how you have issues with actually hurting your mix rather than helping it. And it's just bad news bears all around. So the first commandment, and then if you missed this, I'm just going to go over it again because I know it was really choppy. The first commandment is to EQ with intention. And that's really key because anytime you're mixing, you should mix with intention, and EQing is no different. And what is the two things that you're trying to achieve when you're EQing? You're trying to achieve separation in general, separation between your tracks, and clarity. You're trying to clear up the tracks, whatever they may be, whether it's a vocal or a guitar or having a specific tone sit better in the mix, whatever it is, that's what you're trying to achieve. So if you're EQing without intention, if you just plug in an EQ and start messing around, it's not really going to be effective for you, and you are more likely to hurt your mix than help it. The second commandment, and I kind of wrote it right over here, is you don't have to EQ everything. Not everything needs to be EQ'd. Again, that kind of ties to the first commandment, because if you just feel like, okay, now I'm at the point where I'm EQing in the mix and I'm just going to put an EQ on every single track just because I have to, just because that's what you do, you're not doing that with intention again. And that's a mistake that I know I made when I first started out mixing. I thought, oh yeah, it's just part of it. You just put an EQ on it. And I was making too many moves. And it was not helping my mixes. So the third commandment here, and I don't have my eraser, but is cut before you boost. Now, I love this commandment. This is one of my favorite commandments because, and it just makes sense. Cuts tend to be, in my mind, more effective for dealing with problems in specific frequencies, which is really what you're trying to accomplish when you're EQing. A lot of EQ by its very nature, and Trina Shoemaker, who's a Grammy winner, she told me this, it's reparative by its very nature. Now, of course, you can boost and do things for creativity, and you should do that, but by its very nature, EQ is meant to address issues in the sound in your mix. And you can be a lot more effective doing that if you cut before you boost. It's also easier because if you think about it, let's say I had, I have whatever, 250 hertz, 300, and then 350. Okay? I've got 250, 300, 350. And let's say I decide, for whatever reason, oh man, I really like 250 and I really like 350. I'm just going to boost here. I'm using a parametric EQ in this situation, and I'm going to boost here. Well, that's two moves, right? Well, what if, instead of doing that, I just say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to do a little cut here at 300. By its very nature, what I have done by making a cut here and de-emphasizing this frequency, I have boosted naturally 250 and 350 because now they're emphasized while I've made a cut here. It's easier, it's faster. So that's why I say cut before you boost. Now, other things. The fourth commandment, and this is kind of tied to the cutting and boosting. Cut narrow, boost wide. That's the fourth one. Cut narrow, boost wide. And you should follow this in almost all situations. And here's why. It's really quite simple. First of all, if you cut narrow and you boost wide, our ears, if you're boosting narrow, it will sound more unnatural to our ears. So, you know, a narrow boost, you know, if you're making a move like this, as opposed to a more natural curve, then it's going to sound unnatural. That's just kind of how it works. Meanwhile, if you are cutting wide, if you're making a big cut like this, what you're doing is you're going to take out a bunch of extra frequencies that are important to the character of the sound. And what can happen there is that can make it sound unnatural because you've taken out all of these key frequencies. So it's more effective to make a narrow cut. So that's the other commandment there. So cut narrow, boost wide. Of course, in any of these commandments I'm saying, these are rules of thumb. And don't let anyone ever tell you that mixing is, you know, oh yeah, you must follow all these rules and it's going to work for every track, every type of music till the end of time. Because of course there is opportunity for creativity and doing the best you can, right? But that's just a rule of thumb there. The fifth commandment here, small moves add up. And this is so huge, especially for those who are starting out or may have struggled with EQing or whatever the case may be. Realize that the more, you know, if you're making little cuts, if you're making boosts here and you're doing this over and over, it adds up. And if you're doing it on every track, it really adds up. So again, be smart with your EQ moves. Don't forget about the entire mix and the fact that each little move you're making can add up. Additionally, number 6, the sixth commandment, is EQ in context and in solo. Now, this is kind of controversial. I know there are people out there who will say you never EQ in solo mode. They will say that is the worst possible thing you can do. I disagree. I think that EQing in solo mode has a role to play, especially if you're really trying to dial in on specific frequencies or deal with a specific problem you're having. You can EQ in solo mode. But the key is also check it in context, because you are EQing for context. Your goal is to make a cohesive mix that has perfect separation and blend and all of these great things that we want out of our mixes. You cannot do that if you're only working in solo mode. Also, if you exclusively work in solo mode and forget about your context, you can make moves to an instrument or a track, and all of a sudden, you're going to realize that this track no longer fits within your mix. It sticks out like a sore thumb in a bad way, and you're unhappy with your results. So EQ in context and in solo for really fine-tuning things. Number 7, the seventh commandment here. High-pass filters and low-pass filters are your friends. Now, I know one of the best tips I ever got was, you know, use a high-pass filter to roll off mud, basically, and roll off those frequencies that you don't need. Because if you do that, then you will clear up your mix a whole bunch. And I agree with that. High-pass filters are great for helping your an instrument stand out more in the mix, because you're just rolling off all that extra stuff, and that will make that instrument, those tones that you want, or whether it's a vocal, a guitar, whatever it is, stand out that much more. Whereas a low-pass filter, low-pass high-cut filter, that's where you're rolling off on the top there, that's great for blend. And that can be great for especially instruments that are occupying lower frequencies that you want them to kind of blend a little bit more, those kinds of things. Boom, use your low-pass filter. So the commandment is high-pass filters and low-pass filters, they're your buddies. Don't be afraid to use them. Be smart with it. Again, kind of going back to that intention, but don't be afraid to do that. 8, and then this is key. And I know, and you've heard this a lot with mixing, use and make your adjustments with your ears. Now there are a lot of tips out there, and later in this presentation I'm going to get to some specific frequencies you can target and things like that. And there are charts and all these kinds of things. You should be EQing with your ears 98.9% of the time. You can use your eyes to kind of, okay, find where your frequency is. And if you read something that's like, hey, target these low mids, these are great, or whatever, that's great, do that. But you should always be listening. Listen, use your ears. Number nine on my 10 commandments here. Learn and reference instrument frequency charts. There should be a link that is posted, maybe, I hope so, to this interactive frequency chart. You've probably seen it. It is fantastic. I highly recommend you use it and learn it. You need to know your frequency spectrums. You need to know where specific instruments fall in the frequency spectrum, because that is how you can say when you're mixing, okay, this instrument needs to own this part of the spectrum. So that's really, really key. The other thing, and the last of my 10 commandments here, is allow your tracks to own their frequency spectrum. And it's what I would call EQ dispersion. And that's something I'm really passionate about. Every track you are working on should have its own frequency spectrum that it is owning, whether it's a guitar or a vocal or a kick drum. It should have its place in the mix. And that, again, goes back to using frequency charts and knowing those and learning those. Because if you aren't doing that, if you don't look, if you pull up your EQs on every single track, go ahead and do that on your next mix. And look at those EQ curves. If they all look the same, or if they all look so wildly different that it's just a mess, then you might be doing something wrong and you might be hurting your mix. Each EQ curve should be unique, and it should be expressive of the character and the tones of that instrument in your mix. And that's so important. That's so key. Okay, so now we're going to talk about EQ techniques. And man, I wish I brought my eraser. Oh well. So EQ techniques. There are a lot of EQ techniques out there. And these are what I think are the most effective to employ when you are trying to EQ. And the first one is the idea of EQ sweeping. And a lot of you guys, if you've had experience with this, you probably are doing this already, but I want to cover it because I think sometimes people don't do it in quite the best way. So EQ sweeping. Now, what is EQ sweeping? Okay, you can do EQ sweeping for two things. The first is what it's most commonly used for, which is to find problematic frequencies, harsh frequencies, things that you wouldn't necessarily want to have in your mix that would kind of ruin it. And basically what you do when you're EQ sweeping is you take one band and you do a boost, and then you sweep through the frequencies and you listen. And if you hear some tones or something that's like, ooh, that's bad, you naturally, you say, okay, well, that means I need to cut something there because that's a problem. So that's EQ sweeping, right? Some keys for this. One, I see a lot of people when they're sweeping, they boost like way too much. They like bring it all the way to the top. That's not really necessary. When you're sweeping, I'd say only boost and sweep by no more than about 10 dB. No more than that. Because if you're boosting so much, I think you're almost making artificial problems at that point. Yes, the point of EQ sweeping is to isolate frequencies and target your cuts. But if you are just boosting it as much as you possibly can, well, of course, you're going to make most things sound pretty bad that way. So you can use EQ sweeping for that. So boost and then cut. So make a boost. Okay, ooh, this frequency doesn't sound so good. Let's make a cut there. The other way you can use EQ sweeping is to find what I call the tonal essence of the track, whether it's the instrument, the vocal, and that's using a different thing. Make a boost and see if you find something that you really like as you're listening to it. And I tend to do this in solo mode. Again, this is another example where you might want to do solo and then contextual once you make your move. But okay, you reach a point and you're like, wow, this tone, like, man, I'm right around 1 kilohertz. This is really great. Well, then you know, okay, maybe that's the tonal essence of that vocal or whatever it is. And then what you can do is you can build the rest of your EQ moves around that. You can make your cuts to other tracks in your mix. You can boost that. You can say, okay, well, I like this. Let's do a wide boost and really make this stand out. Really get that kind of clarity to really just have it sing. That's another way you can use EQ sweeping. Some more EQ techniques that I think are often overlooked is EQ your effects returns. So we all love using effects, sometimes too much, and that's a whole nother conversation for amateur sounding mixes or mixes that really aren't quite radio ready. But EQ your effect returns. So if you've got a reverb going, don't be afraid to slap an EQ on that bad boy when it's returning and kind of shape it. So for example, let's say your reverb is battling your vocal and you're just like, oh man, now I've kind of drowned it out. Well, you can make some cuts in the mid-range frequencies to your return there with an EQ and really help your vocal kind of still stand out, still own those frequencies, and you've got, your good reverb going on. Some other things you can do, like let's say you've thrown a reverb on a track, whatever it is, maybe a guitar reverb or something. You can do some boosts on the top end slightly to just get a little extra energy into the track, into the guitar, get a little extra sound out of it. And that can be really helpful. Another thing is you can roll off the top for more blend. So again, that's if you're using a reverb. I mentioned that before, how you can use roll-offs on the top end for blend, but that of course applies to reverbs. Don't forget to EQ your effects. That can be a really, really effective way of accomplishing something with EQ. Another tip for techniques is parallel processing with EQ. And parallel processing, it's kind of a little bit more advanced, and I know some of you guys who are newer to mixing or whatever, it can seem like, whoa, what's all that? Essentially, all it is, hey, duplicate your track. Try to compress one track. So, okay, you have, for me, I play piano, so I'll duplicate my piano track. And then I'll really compress one. Not over compress it, but give it some good compression. And then I will EQ the other and then mix them together. And I'll EQ it in such a way that the more dynamic track, the one that isn't compressed, can stand out more in kind of your quieter parts, whereas the more compressed track in your louder parts, it can be there. So that's just another technique that kind of using EQ and compression together. So, EQ one, compress the other, and then kind of blend those sounds together, and it can be really, really great. And the last technique that I would want to cover here is using EQ shelves for kind of a more natural cleanup. So before I was talking about using high-pass filters and how powerful those can be to just roll off unneeded frequencies and get rid of mud. But what that can do sometimes, depending on how you're applying it, or if you get too liberal with your use of those high-pass filters, is it can start to create an unnatural sound because, as I mentioned before, you're cutting too many frequencies. You're taking too much out of the track, and you don't want to do that, again, because your moves add up, right? So an EQ shelf can really be helpful, especially if you use it on the lower end, right? To just shelve it, just have a more natural, smooth type of sound, which is just so key to try those kinds of things. That's another technique that I think a lot of people aren't using or I haven't seen used, and I think is really, really helpful. So those are some EQ techniques that I think focusing on your skills with those and working on them can be really, really key. So another thing now, and we're going to go to some EQ frequency recommendations. Bear with me here. All right, and apologies if you cannot read this. I will read through this, but again, and I think a key disclaimer here as I'm giving these recommendations, and I mentioned it earlier, but you've got to use your ears and you've got to listen to your tracks and your individual mix and what it calls for. And I think one of the problems is that often, especially people who are newer or really frustrated with kind of their sound or whatever, they'll take a tip like this and then they'll just say, oh, well, that's all I need to do. I just need to make this cut here and that's going to fix all my problems. And that is just not the case. That is not true. And if anybody ever tells you that, then they're blowing smoke, because that is just not accurate. But anyway, that said, these are some frequencies on some major instruments and things, and I'm going to focus a lot on vocals because I know there's a lot of questions out there about EQing vocals. These are things that I think can help your mix if you think about. So the first one is vocals, if we're EQing vocals. First point here is every vocalist is different. Consider every vocalist as a completely different instrument. I know a lot of you musicians and things like that know that, obviously, right? Some people don't think about that. They think that, well, if I make this move on this vocal, it's going to work on this vocal. Not the case. You should, especially if the vocalist is yourself, or you have friends or bandmates or whoever, you should learn how their vocals behave. Where are their tones? What are some parts of their frequency that is just awesome? And as you go on and get more experience and practice, you'll know, okay, hey, so-and-so, he's got great mid-range. I love it. I could boost that all day. It's great. Again, every vocalist is different. Learn your vocalists, work on that. But in general, if you're working on a vocal, roll off 60 to 90 hertz. I mean, you don't really need that stuff. And oftentimes it can just kind of create extra mud and kind of make your mix a little messier. So I think go ahead, just roll that off. Roll that bad boy off. You don't need it. And again, if you feel you want it or you don't want to lose that, okay, be my guest. But in general, this tip right here is from Trina Shoemaker, who I've referenced before. She's a Grammy winner. Really great, really awesome woman. And she said this. She said, a 2 decibel boost at 15 kilohertz and about another 2 at 5 kilohertz, and that will give your vocal some extra sparkle. That'll make your vocal shine just a little bit. Notice how subtle that move is too. That is not a huge EQ move, but she swears by it, and I saw her doing it in action when I was in the studio with her in New Orleans, and it was working. It was just a guy with a guitar, acoustic guitar, and a guy singing, and she was doing that, and it was making his vocal just shimmer. It was great. Some other tips for vocals: between 2.5 kilohertz and 4 kilohertz, you can make cuts here to deal with harshness. My wife, I love her to death, but sometimes her vocal can get just a little harsh. I immediately start looking in these ranges when I'm mixing her, and maybe do a little notch here and there, whatever, to deal with some of that harshness. If you got a male vocal, a 3 to 6 dB cut. Again, notice we're not talking about cuts of 10 plus here. Some people go to town on that. You don't need to do that. 3 to 6 decibel cut at 325 to 350 hertz can deal with some mud. I at times, especially if I've been knocking back a few the night before, not the best idea to do that if you're recording the next day, but whatever. I can get just kind of some muddy vocals. Well, I target that, and I'll make some cuts there, and that'll help out. That'll be successful there. Some other tips: about 3 kilohertz to 6 kilohertz for presence. That's more for a boost. So again, I say both additive and subtractive EQ are effective strategies to employ when EQing. But so look in those ranges if you want more presence. If you feel that your vocal's kind of sitting too far back in the mix, or you feel that you're losing it, or whatever the case is, target those areas for presence, because that can be really helpful. Another place for when we're talking boosts is about 125 to 250 hertz. That can give the vocals just a little more clarity. This is actually a tip from Bobby Osinski, and he's really great. He's got a lot of great mixing tips, but I wanted to include it here because this was something I got early on that I started doing a little bit, and it was really helping things out for me. And then kind of last here, we've got cuts at 800 hertz to 1 kilohertz for any kind of nasal problems. Some singers, they mean well, but they can get a little nasally. My cousin is like that. He's got a great voice, but sometimes he just gets a little up here. And so you can target that for cuts to just kind of make things just sit a little better and shimmer a little more, which is what you want. So those are vocals. And I wanted to talk about this real quick before moving on to some other instruments. Low mids are the enemy. Okay? Low mids are the enemy. That's 200 to 500 hertz. I really consider those the enemy. And they're the enemy for a number of things. One, they are the enemy if you are trying to preserve headroom and make your mastering engineer not want to kill you. Making some cuts here can preserve some more headroom for you, and there, for whatever reason, just a ton of gain can happen here if you are just boosting the heck out of these low mids, or you've just got a bunch of instruments with all that going on. So I really do consider them the enemy. The other thing there is you can also get some extra mud there. Again, notice for mud 325 to 350, so that's right in there for the male vocal. Again, target that with a number of instruments, and you'll find that you might have some mud there. So always kind of consider those guys, look at those guys, and I think some people will say it's 250 hertz is really the one that is the problem. But I just want to give you a range to just think about as you're mixing. So, okay, low mids are the enemy. We'll talk about guitar for a second here, and in general, I'm just talking about electric guitar here. There are other tips I have. I have a EQ cheat sheet that if you're a subscriber, you should have gotten, and it does cover some acoustic things. But in general, 5 to 8 kilohertz to cut through your mix. So a boost there, or kind of carving out other instruments, so making cuts around there for other instruments can help your guitar cut through your mix. And especially when you start adding reverb and start playing around with vocals and all these kinds of things, you can kind of lose your guitar a bit. And again, that's bad news bears. You don't necessarily want that. Another tip here is high-pass filter at 80 kilohertz for mud. Again, that's just another case where, hey, roll that bad boy off and see how it sounds. If you find that you're getting an unnatural sound, you can go back to that technique I was talking about with shelving. So maybe don't roll it all off, but just do a shelf to just kind of cut a good amount of it out of there to kind of try to attack the mud without losing completely these frequencies that you want. That's just another sort of strategy you can employ. Bass cuts. So if you're working with a bass guitar, again, I'm focusing on a lot of cuts here because going back to my sort of commandment there, cut before you boost, I really do think that you should be thinking in, I guess I do fall into the subtractive EQ camp, but I'm not afraid to boost, so that's why I consider myself both. But anyway, some cuts. 60 to 200 hertz, that can reduce boom. Sometimes when you got a bass player and he's just, really rocking out, and you get a real boomy bass. Sometimes you might want that. Other times that can be, you don't want that. 60 to 200 hertz there, you can make some cuts, you can reduce that boom, and that can really help out your mix. 350 to 700 for boxiness, that kind of boxy sound. Again, it's kind of hard to describe that. It's one of those things that, especially if you're newer, you'll hear it and you'll know if things are kind of sounding boxy to you. But anyway, 350 to 700, making some key cuts there can be very helpful. And we covered guitar, we covered bass. Now we've got our kick. Everybody loves the kick drum, right? If you make a notch at 240 hertz, that can really help that thump, that thump that we love in our kick drums, especially for any of you guys who are mixing any kind of sort of hardcore sort of music, or really you guys that are kind of in the EDM or anything like that. Boom, 240 if you want a little extra kick. but it can be effective in rock music and all sorts of other things. And then if you're dealing with your kick for whatever reason, how it was recorded, or even if it's a virtual instrument or something like that, 150 to 350 hertz cuts that can get rid of some more mud there. Notice a lot of these cuts are for kind of getting rid of mud. That's one of the biggest things I think you're trying to do with EQ. You know, okay, yeah, working for separation and clarity. Well, yeah, part of that clarity is getting that mud out of there. Last, the snare. Now, if you've been around any experienced engineers, they will tell you that they can spend hours, weeks, days, months at a time working on the snare. Everybody wants to get that snare right. And I confess, I still, sometimes I'm not happy with how my snares are coming out. Just a real quick tip there. If you want a fatter snare, and I know a lot of people like just a fatter snare, boost that at 240. 240 hertz gets you a fatter snare, and it's pretty solid. So, okay. Again, these are just some guidelines and some suggestions I have. I could go all day about different kinds of instruments and things like that, and there's way more moves that could be done on any of these kinds of tracks. The idea is these are good starting points, and you'll find too frequencies that you like, not only with the vocals as I was talking about, but you'll find for your type of music, yeah, I really like this in this guitar. I really like this in my kick. And the point is through practice and knowing where the instrument falls on the frequency spectrum and knowing which tones you like and things like that, that's how you'll find those frequencies you do want to target. Okay, so that's that. Now, at my last thing here, I wanted to talk about some questions that Recording Excellence subscribers had. And I had some of these questions were emailed to me. A lot of them were posted on the comment thread in Facebook. So the first one was someone asked for Deessers. If I could just give a brief overview of Deessers. So essentially, you may know there's a thing called sibilance, and maybe you're getting some of this right now because I'm using just a USB mic here. But sibilance is those hard sounds, those S's specifically, that are kind of harsh and unpleasant, and you don't want those in your mix. And you can actually get a lot of those, especially if you're boosting vocals around specific areas. You can definitely have some problems with your sibilance there. So Deessers essentially are their compressors with a high-pass filter built into the sidechain. Okay, so they're kind of a compressor slash EQ put together. Now here's just some points on Deessers. One, I know a lot of mixing engineers feel that Deessers are overused for vocals, and I tend to agree with them. I think we want Deessers to be this one-click fix for any kind of sibilance. And what they can do is, because it's this compressor mixed with this high-pass filter, you can really actually hurt a vocal if you're just throw a Deesser on it and leave it. And sometimes that cannot serve the vocal. I know, again, referencing Trina Shoemaker, she is very hesitant to just use Deessers because of what they can take away from a vocal. So if that's the case, and you're thinking, okay, well, should I use a Deesser or not? You can DS with just your straight up EQ. And how you can do that is you can target sibilance in generally the 4K to 8K, 4 kilohertz to 8 kilohertz range. Making cuts there can really help. You can also limit the need for de-essing by what I say is getting it right at the source. Record a better vocal and you'll probably have less issues. So that's de-essers. The other thing you can do with de-essers, and this takes a lot more time, but some engineers like to do this, they will literally go through and isolate the S sounds in their mix. So they'll cut, in Pro Tools or whatever it is, they'll go through and they'll manually cut each S, and then they'll apply an EQ just to that specific S, just to bring off some of those frequencies and then put it back in. That's time consuming, and a lot of mixing is time consuming. But what it can do is really preserve a lot of great tones and presence in the vocal, and completely avoid having to, take away so much from the vocal just to deal with a few S's, a few P pops, a few whatever. So that's de-essers. Another question we had: compress or EQ first? This is a question I've heard a lot, and a lot of people ask it in different ways. They say, "Oh, should I, what should I do? Should I EQ or compress first?" This is another thing that's kind of a rule of thumb. So I'm not going to say that you always need to do it this way, but I'm going to say 9 times out of 10, it's good to do it this way. I like to EQ before I compress. Here's why. Think about it this way. If you are EQing to deal with some mud, okay, and you have a muddy track, whatever it is, a muddy bass, a muddy vocal, whatever it is, and you eventually want to compress that vocal or compress that bass. If you compress it first, then what you're doing is you are compressing and bringing out more of that mud. Your compressor is gonna make it more muddy. Well, if you EQ first and then compress, what have you done? You've taken the mud out, and then you're just compressing the non-muddy track or the less muddy track. To me, that just makes more sense. So that's why, in general, 9 times out of 10, I'm going to be using my EQs first. Those are my first moves I'm doing in my mix. I'm working on the track. I'm working with that. I also think when it comes to getting separation in things, compression isn't always about getting separation. EQ is more of that. And after you get your kind of initial mix, you worked on your panning and all this and that, and you've got your kind of initial layout, and you start going to EQ things. You want to get separation before you just start compressing stuff, and you can just easily get in a big old mess, and you don't want that. Another question I got was, what EQ do you use? I know a lot of people like specific plugins and things like that. The first thing I'll say, and maybe this is controversial, I don't think it matters so much what EQ you use. I think it matters way more the skills you have in your ear and how you're listening and the principles you follow in EQing, as opposed to, oh, I have the world's greatest EQ. But in terms of what I use, typically I use my stock plugin, because I mix in Logic Pro. I use their stock EQ. It works for me. I like it. But I have used in the past the FabFilter Pro Q. That is really nice. It's a little pricey. So don't feel like you have to go out and buy an EQ plugin if you want to do that. And again, there's some great EQ plugins out there. But my thing would be, don't focus so much on getting the perfect EQ. Focus on, hey, how do I get my skills with EQ better? So that's what EQ I use. Okay. So this is a good question. EQing with hearing loss or any kind of environmental recommendations I have for EQing. And really, these would all be, I guess, just general environmental mixing recommendations I'd have. If you are EQing with hearing loss, I think using headphones can be really helpful to help you kind of dial in on those frequencies, because it's just a little harder if you're mixing on monitors to really dial in. But that said, environmentally, I approach mixing, I think, both. If you can, use your monitors while you're EQing, but then use your headphones as well. Try to mix on both. I tend to think that mixing exclusively on one or the other kind of limits you, and you're not going to hear things that you want to hear. EQing on monitors, that can show you how your moves are behaving in space. So if you're boosting certain frequencies and things are rattling around, you can kind of know, this is not behaving well in this room. Or if you're doing on headphones, that can be really helpful too, to just kind of dial in. So with hearing loss, I know it's a challenge, but I would say both. It's okay. Definitely, though, you probably might want to lean towards headphones, just because it's a lot harder to hear some things on monitors, unless you have just a really bomb-ass studio. So the other question I got here is, it was, should we use two 7-band EQs, one for boosts and one for cuts? So, use whatever you want. You can use as many EQs as you want. I tend to think that you should be very wary. Before I mentioned about how small moves add up, if you are using two 7-band EQs, and I assume that you're talking about just like one track, and you're using one EQ just for cuts, and then you're using one 7-band EQ just for boosts, I think you can really quickly like have way too many EQ moves on your track, and that could be disastrous for your mix. It could be not a good thing. So I tend to think, what I like to do is just slap one 7-band EQ, and I'm going to know on what specific instrument, okay, I want to boost this, I want to cut this, I'm going for these tones, and I will make my moves on that instrument specifically with just one EQ, with one multi-band EQ there. And then the rest, if I'm adding EQs to other places, I'm just kind of building around that. So I'll know, hey, I boosted this vocal, or I boosted this guitar at 6K. And I really wanted that to stand out. So I'll know as I'm mixing my other tracks, well, I want to keep that, I want to preserve that 6K. Rather than kind of do some crazy, well, I'm going to cut at 5 and then cut at 7 and then boost at 6 and do it with all different, you don't need to do all that. That's just kind of my opinion. Feel free to do whatever you want because, hey, I mean, it's mixing. It's creativity. Do I need to use linear phase EQs? This is a really good question. And I think there's a lot of confusion about linear phase EQs. So linear phase EQs, they are essentially EQs. Anytime you're using a normal EQ, it affects the phase of the track slightly. Like you can't, unless you're doing just really crazy moves, most of the time you cannot tell. Linear phase EQs, the way they function, and I'm not going to get into all the technical audio stuff because even I don't understand all of it, But the point is that it doesn't affect the phase. So what a lot of people like to do is use linear phase EQs. My opinion is that when it comes to mixing, you don't necessarily need to use linear phase EQs unless you're having just some real big phase problems. We've used normal EQs. Mixing engineers have used normal EQs for years and years and years. They survived before they were linear phase EQs. And I tend to think you don't necessarily need them so much in your mix unless you're kind of really trying to deal with a specific problem. However, linear phase EQs are very helpful in the mastering process. So if you're mastering a song, that is when I would suggest, use linear phase EQs. But again, this is just my opinion. I know there might be some people out there who are like, I use a linear phase EQ. I never leave home without it. That's great for you. For me personally, you don't necessarily need to do that. Okay, we're about 2 p.m. I've got maybe a couple more questions here. Another one. This was good. What's the biggest EQ mistake you've made? And for me, it is using too much EQ. And I kind of alluded to that earlier about EQing with intention. I have ruined mixes before by doing too many cuts, too many boosts, and just getting lost. You can get lost at a point where you have just created a mess. You don't have blend, you don't have separation, you have specific instruments sticking out in ways you don't want them to stick out, and it's just not good. So too much EQ. Again, little moves add up. Okay, and then the last question I have here is, and I can't remember exactly how it was phrased. I just kind of took notes here, but carving out track by track. So I think the question was, do you carve out things track by track, or how do you approach that? And if I think I'm understanding the question right, apologies if not. But I guess I'll answer it this way. I kind of talked about this idea of EQ dispersion before, and using your equalizer to make sure that every track owns its own part of the frequency spectrum. I am a big fan of going track by track and considering, ask yourself one question. Okay, does this need to be EQ'd? I think so. 2, what's my goal when I'm EQing it? And then slap an EQ on it. Consider where it's falling within the frequency spectrum, whatever it is, and go from there. So yeah, in that case, I do some carving track by track. And then if you're doing the solo and contextual moves that I've talked about, and you're checking it in solo mode to really kind of fine tune things, and then you go, okay, how is this contextually? And you should do that, by the way, after every real move. You should probably bounce back, because if you don't want to have a case where you did all this work and then in solo mode and then, oh, okay, now I'm in context and this track sounds like crap. So yeah, I do carve out track by track in general, and just always be smart and intentful when you're doing that. All right, guys, so that's pretty much all I have for today. I wanted to thank you guys so much for joining me. Again, I apologize for the technical issues. That was had to do a little thinking on my feet there. This is, again, I did this in honor of the Ultimate Mixing Blueprint, which is this 8-disc DVD set I put together that I think just has so much great stuff to offer you in helping you get a more radio-ready mix and deal with some of those challenges that I dealt with when I started out and had frustrations and things like that. So the link should be posted to the checkout page. If you want to get the 8-disc DVD set, please go and fill it out. And remember too, I have a 100% money back guarantee. So if you don't think it's helpful to you and you're just unhappy with it, let me know. I'll refund your money. I don't want your money if it doesn't help you. Really, the closing thought here is EQ, equalization, is one of the most powerful tools a mixing engineer has at his or her disposal. And using that effectively can be the difference, in my mind, between a mix that's radio ready and that you're going to send off to your mastering engineer and they're going to love it, or the difference between a mix that is kind of amateur and it's got harshness and it's got it's just a mess and it's just not great. So the key is, guys, take some of this stuff, take some of these rules, these suggestions, and practice. Don't feel like you have to go buy new gear, buy something. Just practice, and hey, go out there and make some great music. Thanks, guys.